In 1941, the Americans built a tank so tall, so awkward, and so dangerous that even the men assigned to fight inside it were uneasy. It loomed nearly 10 feet above the ground, an armored tower crawling across the battlefield. The British mocked it. The Germans laughed at it. The Soviets, with brutal honesty, called it a coffin dot at first glance. The criticism seemed fair. The M3 medium tank looked like a relic dragged forward from another era. Its armor was riveted, not welded. Its profile was absurdly high. And instead of a modern turret-mounted main gun, its most powerful weapon was jammed into the side of the hull, protruding as a naval cannon bolted onto a land vehicle. It didn't look like the future of armored warfare. It looked like a mistake that somehow made it into production. By every modern standard of tank design, the M3 was wrong. It was too tall to hide, too clumsy to maneuver gracefully, too dangerous to inspire confidence in its own crew. Enemy gunners could spot it from miles away. A single well-placed hit could turn its own rivets into deadly fragments inside the fighting compartment. No army wanted a tank like this. No tanker wanted to fight in one, and yet war does not wait for ideal solutions. In the deserts of North Africa, where British armor had been outgunned and outmatched for nearly 2 years, this ungainly machine arrived at exactly the right moment. Against all expectations, the M3 did something no British tank had managed since the fighting began. It forced the German advance to slow. It shattered assumptions. It made seasoned Panzer crews hesitate. For the first time, Erwin Rommel faced a battlefield where his tanks could be seen, targeted, and destroyed before they could strike back. The M3 medium tank didn't stop Rommel because it was elegant or advanced or safe. It stopped him because it existed when nothing better could. In June 1940, German armored divisions tore through France in just 6 weeks. What stunned the world was not the speed of the victory, but how completely the French army collapsed under the weight of coordinated armor, air power, and maneuver. This was not the slow, grinding tank warfare many planners had expected. It was something new and terrifyingly effective. The Germans didn't win because they had more tanks. In fact, the Allies often had greater numbers. They won because they understood how to use them. German crews were better trained. Their commanders concentrated armor at decisive points instead of spreading it thin. Tanks moved fast, communicated constantly, and struck as a unified force. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a revolution. American military planners watched the newsreels carefully. They didn't see a French failure. They saw a warning. Modern war had changed. Tanks were no longer supporting weapons, creeping forward behind infantry. They were now the main striking arm of the battlefield, the tools that decided campaigns in weeks instead of years. Any army that failed to adapt would be crushed. The United States Army was dangerously unprepared for this reality. In 1940, America possessed fewer than 400 tanks. Most were light vehicles armed only with machine guns or small cannons designed for an earlier era. They were suitable for training, policing actions, or colonial wars, not for facing the most experienced armored force in the world. If the United States entered the war, its soldiers would meet German Panzer divisions with equipment that was already obsolete. The Army knew exactly what it needed: a medium tank armed with a 75mm gun. Not simply to destroy enemy armor, but to fire high-explosive shells, knock out gun positions, crush fortifications, and support infantry under fire. One tank. One gun, multiple roles. There was only one problem: American industry wasn't ready to build it, at least not yet. Designing a modern tank was not just a question of firepower, it was a question of physics and manufacturing. A proper 75mm gun produced enormous recoil. To handle those forces safely, the gun had to be mounted inside a rotating turret supported by a massive steel ring, more than 5 feet in diameter. When the gun fired, that ring absorbed the shock and distributed it through the hull. In 1940, this was the wall American industry slammed into. U.S. foundries simply did not have the capability to cast turret rings that large with the necessary precision. The machining tolerances were unforgiving. A slight flaw could cause the turret to jam, crack, or fail catastrophically under recoil. The tools didn't exist. The trained workforce didn't exist. And solving both problems would take time, at least 18 months. The M4 Sherman was already being designed. On paper, it was exactly what the Army wanted: a balanced medium tank with a fully rotating 75mm turret, reliable mechanics, and a lower profile. But blueprints do not stop enemy tanks. Factories do. The reality was brutal. The Sherman would not reach the battlefield in meaningful numbers until late 1942. The Army, facing a rapidly expanding global war, could not wait. It needed tanks immediately. That urgency forced engineers to revisit an idea most considered outdated. Instead of mounting the 75mm gun in a turret, they would place it directly into the hull. The concept was old, even embarrassing. World War I tanks had used similar arrangements. A hull-mounted gun could only fire within a narrow arc. To engage targets to the side, the entire vehicle had to turn, costing precious seconds in combat. Everyone understood the drawbacks, but everyone also understood the alternative. A flawed tank with a powerful gun was infinitely better than a perfect tank that didn't exist. In July 1940, the Army approved the design. By August 1941, American factories were building it. The compromise had a name: the M3 medium tank. The M3 medium tank was impossible to miss. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, towering over the desert like a rolling steel building. Where other tanks hugged the ground, the M3 rose above it, an armored silhouette visible from miles away. This height wasn't the result of ambition, it was the result of compromise stacked on top of compromise. At the rear sat a large radial aircraft engine, originally designed for airplanes. It was powerful and reliable, but it was also tall, forcing the hull upward. In the front right of the vehicle, engineers installed the main weapon, a massive 75mm gun mounted directly into the hull. It could fire devastating shells, but only within a limited arc. Above that, squeezed into a cramped turret, sat a smaller 37mm gun intended to deal with lighter targets. And above even that was the commander's cupola, giving the tank its distinctive and infamous three-tiered profile: 3 levels of steel, 7 crewmen packed inside. Barely enough room to move. The armor itself was riveted steel, not welded. On paper, it offered respectable protection. In reality, it carried a hidden danger. When enemy rounds struck the outside of the tank, even without penetrating, the impact could shear rivet heads from the interior. Those rivets became high-speed fragments, ricocheting through the fighting compartment like shrapnel in a confined metal box. To enemy gunners, the M3 was an obvious target. Its height made concealment nearly impossible, especially on flat desert terrain. It was often the first tank spotted, the first tank engaged, and the first tank fired upon. To the men inside, it was worse. American tankers didn't just mock the M3's appearance. They feared it. They knew its weaknesses. They understood that its height invited enemy fire and that its own armor could betray them. Fighting inside the M3 required a level of nerve that went beyond confidence in the machine, and yet, despite every flaw, it rolled off the production lines in massive numbers. Between 1941 and 1942, American factories built more than 6,000 M3s. They did so not because the tank was loved, or admired, or even trusted, but because war does not wait for perfect solutions. The M3 was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to exist. By early 1942, British armored forces in North Africa were close to breaking. Month after month, they had fought across vast stretches of desert against an enemy that seemed to hold every advantage. For 18 long months, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had dominated the campaign, pushing British forces back again and again, seizing ground, and dictating the tempo of the war. The problem was not courage. British tank crews fought hard, often advancing straight into enemy fire. The problem was firepower. Most British tanks were armed with 40mm, 2-pounder guns, weapons designed to defeat light armor at short range. Against early German tanks, they had once been adequate. By 1941, they were dangerously insufficient. At typical combat distances, British shells struggled to penetrate German frontal armor. Crews would score solid hits, watch sparks flash, and then see the shells ricochet away without effect. Moments later, German return fire would arrive. German 50mm guns punched through British armor with terrifying ease. Tanks that had survived multiple impacts suddenly erupted in smoke and flame. Crews had little warning. A single well-placed hit was often enough to destroy the vehicle and everyone inside it. Worse still, British tanks lacked effective high-explosive ammunition. When they encountered anti-tank guns, infantry positions, or fortified defenses, they had almost no way to fight back. Machine guns were useless against dug-in crews. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns learned they could operate in the open. Confident that British tanks could not silence them at range. Each engagement followed the same brutal pattern. British crews were forced to close to suicidal distances just to have a chance of damaging enemy armor. They knew that as they advanced, German gunners could already kill them long before they reached effective range. This wasn't just a tactical disadvantage. It was a crisis of confidence. Tank crews went into battle knowing their weapons were inadequate. They understood the math. They knew they would likely be destroyed before they could strike back. Over time, that knowledge wore them down as surely as enemy fire. By early 1942, British commanders faced a grim reality. Without a dramatic change in firepower, North Africa would be lost. They didn't just need reinforcements, they needed a miracle. In January 1942, something unfamiliar rolled off transport ships and into the Egyptian desert. The first American-built M3 Grants had arrived, towering over the British tanks parked nearby. Crews gathered around them in silence, craning their necks to take in the height. Compared to the low, sleek profiles of Crusaders and Stuarts, the Grant looked almost absurd. It was tall. It was awkward. And it was undeniably ugly. On the flat desert, its silhouette seemed impossible to hide. British tankers joked that the enemy could spot it from Cairo. No one mistook it for a masterpiece of engineering. But once the crews looked past the shape, their attention fixed on something else. The gun mounted in the hull was a 75mm cannon unlike anything British armor had fielded in North Africa. This was not a specialized weapon. It was a solution. The same gun could fire armor-piercing rounds capable of killing enemy tanks and high-explosive shells, designed to obliterate anti-tank guns, infantry positions, and field fortifications. When the Grants were test-fired, the mood changed immediately. British gunners watched shells fly farther and hit harder than anything they had ever handled. At ranges where their 2-pounders had been useless, the 75mm struck with lethal force. Armor plates that represented German tanks were smashed clean through. Targets that had once required dangerous advances could now be destroyed from a distance. Just as important as the raw performance was what it did to morale for nearly 2 years. British tank crews had gone into battle knowing they were outmatched. Now, for the first time, they possessed a weapon that allowed them to dictate the engagement instead of reacting to it. They could kill tanks before being killed. They could silence guns that once dominated the battlefield. The Grant was not elegant. It was not comfortable. And it was not forgiving, but in the desert of North Africa, it represented something the British had nearly forgotten: the ability to fight back. On the morning of May 27, 1942, German Panzer divisions advanced near the Gazala line with complete confidence. This was familiar ground. Time and again, British armor had been drawn into battle and destroyed at predictable ranges. German commanders expected the same pattern to repeat: close the distance, open fire, and break the British line. They advanced to what had always been a safe distance, and then British guns opened fire from 1,200 meters. At first, German commanders were confused. British tanks had never been effective at that range. But the shells were not falling short. They were hitting and they were penetrating. One Panzer erupted in flame. Then another. Smoke and fire bloomed across the desert in places that should have been untouchable. The reason became clear too. Late. The M3 Grant 75mm gun could penetrate. the frontal armor of a Panzer III from over a kilometer away. At the same distances, the short-barreled 50mm guns mounted on most German tanks were powerless. Their shells struck the Grants and failed to penetrate. To kill the new British tanks, German crews had to close to point-blank range. That meant driving straight into fire, a killing zone had opened in the desert, hundreds of meters of open ground, where British gunners could destroy German armor that could not shoot back. Every second spent crossing that zone meant another chance for a Grant crew to fire again. Each hit turned another Panzer into a burning wreck. Veteran German crews, men who had dominated the desert for months, found themselves under attack by weapons they could barely see. Radio traffic dissolved into panic. Crews shouted about tanks exploding at impossible distances, about invisible guns firing from the horizon. This was not how the Desert War was supposed to work. Rommel received the reports and understood immediately what had changed. The British had been given a weapon that altered the engagement math. For the first time in North Africa, German armor no longer held a clear technical advantage. And that realization carried consequences far beyond Gazala. The M3 Grant did not win the North African campaign. It did not storm Tobruk, cut off Rommel, or decisively end the Axis advance. In many ways, it was a flawed and awkward tank, clumsy on the battlefield and far from perfect. Yet, in the unforgiving desert, it performed a different kind of victory, one measured not in captured ground, but in survival and attrition. Rommel was quick to adapt. The Afrika Korps pushed forward as always, bringing 88mm guns into action and introducing newer Panzer IV models to counter the new British threat. Tobruk fell, as he had planned, and the desert continued to favor his maneuver tactics. British formations retreated, positions shifted, and Rommel maintained his operational advantage. On paper, the campaign still favored the Germans, but the battlefield had changed in a crucial, invisible way: the industrial war behind the guns. Germany's factories could produce only a few hundred tanks per month. Each Panzer destroyed in the desert was irreplaceable. Skilled crews lost alongside their vehicles were even harder to replace. The Afrika Korps was strong, but not infinitely so. Every loss left gaps that could not be quickly filled. In contrast, the Allies, especially the United States, were producing tanks by the thousands. Every M3 Grant destroyed could be replaced in a matter of weeks. Crews trained, vehicles repaired, and new shipments continued to flow into the theater. The desert, once a place where German equipment and tactics dominated, was becoming a test of endurance rather than pure skill. By mid-1942, the toll was apparent. Rommel's units had achieved tactical victories, but each advance came at a growing cost. His armor and crews were being slowly depleted, bled dry against a force that could absorb losses the Germans could not. The Grants did not win the battles outright, but they created conditions in which the Axis could not sustain its campaign. The M3 wasn't a perfect weapon. It was tall, awkward, and tactically flawed. Its sponson gun limited mobility, its riveted armor created internal hazards, and it was far from the ideal medium tank, yet it served its purpose. It delayed Rommel, forced costly adaptations, and bought the Allies critical time. In war, survival can be as decisive as victory, and in the desert, the M3 Grant proved that just existing when nothing better is available can change the course of a campaign. By October 1942, a new chapter in armored warfare had begun. The M4 Sherman had finally arrived in North Africa. Unlike its predecessor, the Sherman embodied everything the M3 Grant had never been: lower, sleeker, and more maneuverable, with a fully rotating turret that allowed its 75mm gun to strike in any direction. Its design addressed every compromise the M3 had forced upon engineers. Where the Grant had been tall, awkward, and limited, the Sherman was modern, balanced, and lethal, a proper medium tank ready for the rigors of mechanized warfare. The battlefield where the Shermans debuted was the Second Battle of El Alamein, a decisive confrontation that would determine control of North Africa. Here, the Allies assembled an overwhelming concentration of armor, artillery, and infantry. Thousands of tanks, including the new Shermans and remaining M3 Grants, faced Rommel's exhausted Afrika Korps, which had already been bled by months of attritional warfare, when the battle began on October 23rd. The difference was clear. Allied tanks moved in coordinated waves, using firepower, numbers, and improved tactics to systematically dismantle Axis positions. The M3 Grants, tall and awkward as they were, continued to serve as sturdy platforms for infantry support and defensive fire. They held lines, absorbed enemy attention, and ensured that Rommel could not exploit gaps in the Allied advance. Meanwhile, the Sherman spearheaded breakthroughs, using their mobility and rotating turrets to outmaneuver and outgun remaining German armor. In just 12 days, Rommel's forces were forced into a full retreat. The Afrika Korps would never recover its former strength in North Africa. Strategic control had shifted, and the campaign was effectively decided. For the M3 Grant, the war was over. It had been replaced on the front lines by a tank that corrected every flaw and improved upon every limitation. Yet to view the Grant as a failure would be a mistake. Its role had never been to win decisive victories or spearhead offensives. It was built to exist when nothing better could, to fill a gap, and to hold the line until superior armor arrived, and in that purpose it had succeeded completely. The M3 Grant bought the Allies time, preserved positions, inflicted irrecoverable losses on Rommel's armored forces, and helped shape the conditions for victory. When the Sherman finally took the field, the M3 passed the torch, but it had already proven that in war, even an imperfect weapon can change history. Today, museum visitors walk past the M3 without a second glance on their way to Shermans, Tigers, and Panthers. They see an awkward silhouette and ask the wrong question: why would anyone build something so ugly? The right question is this: what happens when a nation chooses good enough now instead of perfect later? If you enjoy stories where engineering, industry, and war collide and where flawed machines change history, subscribe to the channel. Because some of the most important weapons were never meant to be admired.